Well, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Miller from Minding the Story, and it's really great to see you guys today. If you can and you feel comfortable leaving your video on, that is always preferable. If you are somewhere like driving or somewhere where it wouldn't be safe or wouldn't be a good idea, then I do understand. Um, so just to give you a little bit of background about what this is. Um, so I've been, a teacher for a really long time, and I became interested in mythology and the ideas of the stories of who we are, right, from all the civilizations and time periods and things. And I started noticing some similarities that just spoke to the stories of being human, right, that everyone could relate to. And that led me to Joseph Campbell, who you may or may not have heard of with The Hero's Journey and with some of his other writings. And then it led me to Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is was a depth psychologist who looked at a lot of the symbols and archetypes and the stories of the psyche that also inform who we are and how we can look at those to gain a deeper understanding of how we operate, how we see ourselves in the world, and to really be able to gain self-awareness. And he called it the individuation, right? The process of knowing knowing who we are, but it's really a coming into wholeness, right? So it's an embracing all of the aspects of who we are in a whole, authentic way, and then being able to move forward with that, right? To be all of who we are. And so he talked a lot about, the different parts of the psyche. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that too. But then this is a very practical approach to understanding ourselves and understanding our stories and the places that kind of keep us stuck, right? So again, after a lot of time of working with mythology and teaching middle school, I went back and got my degree in mythology and depth psychology and the combination of the two. And while I was working on my dissertation, while I was supposed to be writing, I found myself 2 years working with a non-dual teacher. And is anyone familiar with non-duality? So I see some nodding heads, some shaking heads. Non-duality is a Eastern philosophy. It comes out of Advaita Vedanta. It's basically the idea that, people talk about oneness, right? And often when they talk about oneness, it's kind of a very surfacey look at like, oh yes, we should all just be holding hands and realizing how we impact each other. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is true, but it's actually even more than that because there's a sense that non-duality means non-dual, non-two, no two. So the other person is actually an aspect of yourself, right? So the essence that animates us is in everyone and everything, but we experience another person in order for us to learn more about ourselves, the dynamics that happen, right? The things that trigger us, the things that we see that we are afraid of, offer us an opportunity to understand ourselves better, right? Because that self is, in non-dual terms, all that there is, right? So when I was moving from the sense of story into the understanding of how the stories affect how we see ourselves, how we situate ourselves in the world. And then I spent 2 years in not complete silence, but a lot of periods of silence. The combination of all of those, of the moment that the story arose, became really clear to me. And I thought, if people could really understand that most of the time our minds are telling us stories, narrating for us the reasons why things are happening, someone else's motives, why we should now be annoyed at them, and onward, that if there was a way to step back in that moment and really see what was going on so that we could then respond in a healthy way rather than have this kind of emotional reaction that jumps in and then kind of sets all these things in motion that didn't even have to happen in the first place, right? So that's how I then started developing Unstorying. And in a way, it's kind of a misnomer because human beings, um, our mind is created to craft stories. It's always going to tell us what it thinks is going to protect us in a situation, whether it's a physical protection, emotional protection, psychological. And so it's always looking around and crafting, what do we need to know? How do we need to handle that? And then creates these protective mechanisms. So we can't actually fully go without them, but we can see them and gain awareness about them. And then we can work with them and embrace them instead of pushing them away. And so that's what I do is I now work with people with this, and this can help in all areas of your life. It can help in at work, and it can help with relationships, and also with not self-sabotaging, right? So that's what this basically is. And it is a form of shadow work. And what I mean by that is Jung talked about the mind and the psyche. By the way, psyche, if most of you are probably familiar with this, but the word psyche actually means soul, right? As opposed to mind. And one of the reasons for this is that, you have the Greek goddess Psyche, right, who represented the soul. And so the study of the soul was how psychology began. But then at some point in time, it was determined that soul sounded very religious. And so we can't actually have that. We have to separate that out. And so then it became more known as the mind, the study of the mind. But it is all kind of interrelated. And when I refer to soul, I'm not referring to a religious aspect of ourselves per se, spiritual perhaps, but in the essence of us that is aware of the things we're saying, the things we're doing, the things we're interacting with. That essence of us that is in all of us is what the study is of. So Carl Jung talked about the mask of the persona, right? This is the mask we all wear when we think we have to put a character on in order to interact with someone, right? It's a protective function of things that we are afraid of seeing in ourselves, or we are afraid of experiencing again that we might have experienced before. The shadow is a hidden beliefs and understanding and experiences that are kind of in the hidden portion of our mind, the hidden portions of the psyche that are there because we had an early experience, but then we kind of swept it under the rug. Or maybe we sort of know about it, but we don't really want to deal with it. And we think we're fine and we're just going to plow ahead. And then those things come flying back in when we try and interact with someone. So that's kind of the background that I wanted to give you on this sort of thing. Does anyone have any questions about that aspect before I kind of go into the elements of this process? All right, those of you I can see, it looks like it's a no. If you are having your video off and you do want to respond, but you can't put your video on, feel free to use the emojis or to raise your hand, and I can call on you, and we can do all of that. I know a bunch of people will be watching this in the playback, so hopefully there'll be some information for you when you play it back. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna talk a little bit about this process, okay, itself. So let me just turn this on here. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see this? Yeah. All right, so this is the elements of unstorying. All right. So the way this works is first, we just talked a little bit about the nature of the mind. And the nature of the mind takes, and this will all be sent to you. You'll get a link to this, so you don't have to quickly write this down. But the nature of the mind is that it takes in information, right? It takes it in kind of raw data. And when we think about the ways in which we bring in that information, it's through our senses, right? We read something, we saw something, we heard it on a podcast, we smelled it and determined it was safe or not safe, all of our senses. So that raw data comes in and it hits our memory banks. What do we know that that means? Is that something that I want? Is that something that has been pleasant in the past? Is it something unknown and therefore we don't know exactly how to respond to it? Or is it something that was unpleasant, right? Does it remind you of someone? Like you walk onto into a public place and you smell something and it reminds you of someone you had an unpleasant experience with. It might not be that person, but it's going to all of a sudden send you into a story about this new person, right? So once we have those memories, whether we're aware of them or not, we then create the story of what is actually happening now, right? So if someone in your workplace, does something that you determine as thoughtless, right? Uh, they leave something out that should have been put away, or they broke something and then just left it there, or something along those lines. There could be a million reasons why that occurred, but your immediate response to it is going to be based on an old experience of someone who did something like that, or what you believe that means because of an underlying story that you're carrying. It doesn't mean that they're not doing something thoughtless, but your reaction to it is all based in that old story. Okay. So the way this process works is when something happens, right, that triggers a really strong emotional response in us, our tendency is to go with that, to say, yes, that person is the problem. Yes, this is a problem. This is going to cause all kinds of havoc. We go into that story of it. But if you can stop for a moment and go, I'm going to stop, I'm going to retract the projections. So it's not about that person. It's not about that circumstance. I just want to pause for a moment and see why this really strong emotional reaction is coming up in me, right? What is the underlying story for that? And in that pause, you unearth the stories beneath the experience of the present day experience. And we're going to do an exercise on that in a few minutes. And I'm going to walk you through all of these steps, but I just want to talk about them first. Once you have figured out what the story is that's creating such a strong emotional response, and I say that because there are times, and I know I can relate to this, where something seemingly small and minimal has occurred, and most people wouldn't have a reaction to it at all. But for some reason, it sent you into a rage, right? Or it made you not want to leave your house for days, or something along those lines. That's a signpost that there's a shadow story there, right? And I have a friend who, we have a mutual friend, and this mutual friend loves to tell someone how to handle a situation, right? Gives this unsolicited advice in a very judgy kind of way. So my other friend who knows them, every time she interacts with her, she comes back with, how dare she? I that really bothers me. And does she not think I know how to run my own life? And, all of this sort of thing, and gets kind of really annoyed and really agitated. One of her underlying stories as a child was that she didn't know what she was talking about. Her parents had kind of put that story in her, that she didn't know, she wasn't smart enough to figure something out, she couldn't take care of herself. And so that story gets activated when she sees this other person. For me, I have other stories, but that particular story I don't carry. And so when I interact with that same person, I don't have that same feeling. I listen to what she says and I go, oh, those are good ideas. And then I do whatever I feel is the right thing, and it doesn't affect me. So whatever story we're carrying underneath the stories, that's going to tell us how we're going to react, right? Unless we're become aware of it. This is a self-awareness process, basically. All right. So once we've unearthed that we have a story that's causing that, we have to deal with the emotions that come up from it. Because when you have a really strong emotion, frustration, anger, resentment, all of those for fear, anxiety, it's an emotional signature that's in the body. And it has to go somewhere. And often we try and push it away, right? It either overwhelms us and we're in a huge emotional meltdown, or we don't want it anymore and we go and do something, that's when numbing activities come in. That's when people choose things like drinking or eating or whatever. Sometimes, excessive exercising, even they'll do something so that they don't have to feel what is actually bubbling up underneath. Shadow work wants you to feel those things, right? To see what is creating it, what has sparked it in the first place. And then you sit with that energy, right? You process the energy, and it could be something as simple as just breathing exercises, right? Or just realizing what's happening. And once you allow it to be, it can be integrated in as part of you. Then Unstorying has two tracks, and one is not better or worse than the other. It's whatever feels the most resonant for you. And sometimes people do either one, depending on what's happening. So now you've established what is triggering that response. You've sat with the emotion that's coming up without a story. Then one track is to restory the narrative. This is where things like the hero journey comes in, right? Things like seeing yourself as, the hero of your own life, or a problem that arises, instead of it being something happening to you, it's a call to adventure for you, right? Restructuring the story of what's happening. I also have an exercise called flipping the script, which is when you're in conflict with someone and you're having a difficult moment with them, you can see their story from first person, and it expands your perspective on what's going on. And then you can see a bigger story, right? So restoring the narrative is about creating a healthier narrative than you've been holding on to because of the reactivity, right? The other track is more of the non-dual approach, and this is to dissipate the narrative. This is that once you identify what is actually happening under the surface, that it's not really about the other person, right? Or about the circumstances. It's about what it brings up for you. You can, in that moment, just feel really grateful that this has happened, because it's giving you another opportunity to see another layer of the onion of yourself, right? I use the onion a lot. A lot of people use that as a metaphor. Each layer is like a story that we are carrying about ourselves. And when you pull it off, you cry, right? There's an emotional response, but there's always another layer underneath until you get to the center where there's nothing left. So this process is realizing that all you've done is you've had another opportunity to meet yourself. And with that, eventually becomes such a moment of gratitude, right? It doesn't mean that you don't have to respond to whatever was going on. Maybe you don't. Maybe it was a situation all of your own design because of these old stories, and that the other person hadn't done anything at all. And sometimes it is a situation that you have to speak to, or you have to do something about. But after this process, you're actually just responding in a not from that place of reactivity. And all of these tracks, both of these tracks, lead to a lot more space around what is happening, a deeper understanding of what is actually operating in your life. And it's taking the power away from the stories themselves and putting it back with yourself, right? The stories will still arise, but they won't run the show. Okay. Any questions on this? And again, you'll all be sent this in a link. Okay. So let's do a little exercise. I'm going to turn off the screen share. I can figure out how to do it. I have a lot of weird pop-up things on my screen at the moment. I don't know why it's not letting me do this. Oh, there we go. Stop share. All right. Little technological shadow stuff happening here today. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is I want you, and if you have a journal, to think about something that's happened recently. It's easier if it's happened recently, that really sparked a strong emotional reaction in you. It could be in your work life, in your personal life. It could be, I was out at a store and I had an interaction with someone who worked in the store, or it could be anything, but it sparked a reaction of either frustration, resentment, anger, fear, sadness, anxiety, something like that. I will say that this all applies to even the positive emotions too. I usually get asked, well, what about something that sparked joy or whatever? It is totally valid, but it is harder to show you in this exercise what I need to show you if it's something that you want more of. So we tend to not want the unpleasant or painful emotions. And so this exercise is easier to see if you use one of those. Okay, so go ahead and take a few minutes and just write down what happened, how it made you feel, just all of that sort of thing. Okay, we'll just do that for a couple minutes. And I don't make anyone share in my workshops. So don't worry about what you're writing, because you will not be forced to share it. They might ask for a volunteer, but that's about it. It's like most of you are done. I don't know. All right, if you're still writing, that's okay too. But so from that story, if you were to close your eyes for a moment and I were to say to you, how old do you feel in that moment? If you put yourself back there, how old do you feel? Whatever number pops up, don't judge it. Just write that down on your journal. And if no number pops up, that's okay too. But if the first number that pops up. Now, if that number is in the teens or above, see if you can, does anyone have it in the teens or above? Okay, so if it's the teens or above, close your eyes again and see if you've ever felt that same emotion younger than that. And the reason why I've asked, and you don't have to think of a story or anything along with it, just the feeling, right? The reason I do that is because often whatever is the underlying core story in this reaction happened when you were really young for the first time. Because the way that the mind or even the brain kind of categorizes memories is it takes something and then it files it away, it imprints it, right? And we don't even realize it's happening sometimes. So when you're really young, um, if something occurred and you were kind of in the twos and threes, the terrible twos and the time that you have temper tantrums, if you're normally a really calm, placid person, but then all of a sudden there's a certain thing that'll happen that you'll just start like screaming and getting all kind of crazy, then the original core story happened when you were around 2 or 3, because that is how you could defend yourself, right? When you think about a toddler, if something happens in their world that they don't understand or they don't like, they're just gonna start wailing, right? Um, and if you are normally a very articulate person who can explain and debate and do all these things, but then all of a sudden you find yourself where you cannot speak and you can't put thoughts together to say anything that you want to say in some sort of crucial way, then often it's happened when you were pre-verbal was the first core moment of that, right? It's so fascinating because the brain does remember. right? And the mind creates that scenario again. So you can be an adult your entire life and you find yourself in that same scenario that feels the same as something that happened when you were little, really little, and you will go back to that first defense mechanism that you created when you were little. Okay. So now I want you to, again, see yourself in that situation and write down the sentence, I feel, and whatever is the word, the descriptive emotional word that comes after that, write that down. It could be anything from I feel abandoned, I feel unheard, I feel unseen, I feel less than, I feel whatever it happens to be, I feel, and write that down. So whatever you came up with, that is one of your core stories. And the premise is that we all have about 4 or 5 core stories that get created when we're really little. And now, when I say this, it does not to say that anything terrible or traumatic happened to you. It could have, right? People do have stories of trauma from their childhood, but sometimes it's a very subtle thing. And I often tell this story of my niece, who now she's a teenager and she finds some of the recordings of my workshops. She was not going to be happy with her aunt, but it's a perfect story to share this. So she was about a year old right before she started speaking, and I had just moved across the country and moved back to the East Coast to be near them. And my sister-in-law had asked me to babysit. And I didn't know anything about babies. I said, I don't know anything about how to change a diaper, or feed her, or anything like that. She said, come over a few minutes early. I'll run through all those things with you and it'll be fine. It's only going to be 2 hours. I said, okay. So, of course, I was late that day. And as I get to the door, my sister-in-law says, look, I'm late for my appointment. She gives me a hug. She's like, I left you a couple of notes. You'll be fine. And my niece is sleeping in a stroller by the door. So 10 minutes go by or whatever it is, my niece wakes up. She's in her own home. She's with someone she knows, her aunt. There is nothing that is actually a danger there. But before she went to sleep, mommy was there. When she woke up, mommy was not there. And that shock to her system at 1 year old created a terror in her. So all of a sudden, she started panicking. Her little body started shaking. Her eyes became huge saucers like this. I picked her up, I held her, I comforted her. She wanted to see every single room to see if she could find mommy. I was telling her mommy's not home, but mommy's coming right back. The whole thing. I could not get her to calm herself, right? The one thing I was not allowed to do was to set her in front of TV that I was to play with her, right? That was part of, and all the instructions. But she was so stressed in that moment that I really just needed her to be able to calm. So I put her on the floor, turned the cartoons on, and I could see her body relax. But the moment she turned away from the TV and looked at me and saw that it wasn't mommy sitting on the couch, it all started up again. I knew from doing this work that that was an example of a core story being created, right? Because she had to find a way to calm herself and have her defense mechanism, kick in. So you now fast forward 12, years or so. And, I do still know she's wonderful. I love her. She's very well adjusted. But there are sometimes these moments when a panic sets in, right? When it seems like everything is actually okay. And to others, this is not a big deal, like what you're experiencing at the moment. But to her, it becomes back to that existential, panic of things are not where I left them. I don't know if I'm going to be okay. And so that is what happens for all of us, right? She doesn't even remember that experience, of course, at 1, but it will stay with her. So all of us now, that one that you just uncovered is one of a few that when a certain story comes up, it will trigger that response in you. And whether the response is to lash out whether the response is to run away, whether the response is to defend yourself, or whatever it may happen to be, or have an emotional response, that's going to show up again. Now, is that a problem? It depends. It's a problem if we don't know that it's happening, right? And then we kind of throw ourselves into whatever that uncomfortable situation is. It's also a problem when we're having a relationship with someone. And by relationship, it could be a partner, a family member, a friend, a colleague. We bring our core stories into the dynamic and they bring theirs. And that lack of awareness causes friction, causes conflict. Conflict is really one story hitting another story, and they're often survival stories. At their core, they're about fear. Am I going to be okay? I'm not going to be okay if that person takes my job, if that person gets the glory, if that person demeans me, if that person puts me down. I'm not going to be okay. They have their own story that's coming to bear that also stems from something like that too, right? But these experiences are what make that up. So, so this I feel story. So this is the part of the unstorying where you are unearthing the stories underneath. So in a practical setting, once you've been working with unstorying for a while, you would be in some sort of situation in the world and you would feel that red flag of an emotional reaction happening. And usually it's bigger than it would normally need to be for whatever the circumstances are. That's when you stop for a moment. And if you haven't already figured out what your 4 or 5 core stories are, that's when you sit there and you go, okay, forgetting about this person for a second, I feel unseen. I feel taken advantage of. That's the underlying thing, right? And then we do the next steps to kind of really deal with it. And then you can approach them and interact with them. Any questions, or does anyone want to share anything that they have uncovered so far? No, and it's okay. And I would also say, does anyone have any thoughts about what the process was like? You don't have to, not the content of what you unearthed, but the process of being able to see that age or that core story underneath it.
Yeah.
Hi,
Can you
Michelle.
hear me okay? So it was really interesting, the moment you said how old are you in that story? And this age just like boom, it just hit me really hard, you know. So I thought that was really fascinating. And then to go back to someone a little younger, and yes, another time that happened. So I really appreciate that. It's really valuable to me, I think.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I'll share. So I work one-on-one with clients, and it's a very short, like 3 sessions of like boom, boom, boom. It's a process, and then they take that tool with them, with like similar to this. And I had a client once who couldn't figure out why when he had direct reports in his business. He was, he had moved up so far, but then when he wanted to go to the next level, every time he would be in a job interview, he would freeze up. He wouldn't be able to talk about himself or what he's been doing, and he would just get really, really uncomfortable. And so I did some of this work with him, and we ended up unearthing that when he was, 5, he had told his uncle that he wanted to, be the top student in the class, or whatever. And his uncle said, "Oh no, you're always going to be mediocre. You'll never be the top person in the class." And then at 14, he had told a family priest that he wanted to get into this really important university, so that he would feel good, about and his family would be proud of him. And the priest said to him, "No, no, 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 you're thinking too high. Like, just, you're good in the middle there." And then something happened again in his 20s, and he realized that there was that pattern, and all that was happening was that core story was showing up again of, you can achieve somewhat, but don't go for the stars because it's not for you. And so he found that every time he was in these meetings with higher ups who had an authority to be able to promote him again, all that was happening in him was the memory of them thinking he's just mediocre and he's not going to go anywhere. It's really amazing how the mind does that. It really imprints. And so this work undoes that, right? It shines a light on it. And then we work with what to do with that when that happens, right? Thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle. So, okay. So now that we have a sense of at least one story, right, that came up, and that's the removing projections stage. So now there's the sitting with the emotions. So what happens is when you think about the emotional reaction that happened in that present day, right, and the original signature of that emotion that happened when you were little, what do you do with it? Because energy is tangible, right? You can feel it in your body depending on how, sensitive you are to that sort of thing. So you don't want to kind of stamp it out, and you don't want to kind of push it away. You want to be with it. Now, we all have different levels of being able to feel comfortable, right? Being with intense energy in our body. One thing that I do with clients is a breathing exercise. We do square breathing. Is anyone familiar? It might be called box breathing. Some people call it a few different things, right? But the premise is that we're going to do a little bit of this later when we do a guided visualization. But the premise is that you breathe in for the same amount, hold it in for the same amount, breathe out for the same amount, and hold it out for the same amount, right? You do that a few times, and it regulates your nervous system. Because often what's happening is when an emotional is kind of rolling around through you, our heart starts to go fast, or we're breathing really shallow, and we're kind of stressed. So by breathing into that, you can relax a little bit, and you can actually allow the emotion to do its thing, right? It's showing itself to you again, that it used to be there when you were little, right? So one thing are these breathing exercises, right? Another is to do visualizations. And I'm sure that since a lot of you are wellness practitioners, you have your own kind of way of working with this sort of thing. But another way that I suggest is to see the emotion almost as a ball that is rolling through your body, right? It's just rolling around, and you're just allowing it to be there. Okay. And eventually it's going to fall away and kind of trail away. But until you do, just sitting with it and allowing it to kind of move itself through. Right. Um, there's also a case for body work, right? Getting massage, a lot of different modalities, as long as the intention is to integrate it, to feel what the emotion is, and to integrate it into the system, then it is still working with the process. If the intention is, I'm just feeling really, anxious, and I just need you to make it go away by whatever the modality is, then you're just throwing it back into the shadow again, right? Because it's feeling uncomfortable, and we don't want to sit in discomfort. So shadow work is really about embracing the light and the dark, the perceived dark parts of ourselves, as a whole. And so if we push it away, we're going against that, right? So the sitting with the emotions can take a lot of different uh, methods, but the bottom line is that we want to be able to sit with that emotion without the story, because the emotion can throw you back into the story again. It's so intense sometimes that we're looking for someone to be angry at. We're looking to someone to blame. And that, when you go back to like mythology and things like that, there's always the other in every story, right? There's the dragon, there's the demons, there's the whoever the others are. We still, as a society, create others. We do it societally, and we also do it individually in our lives. That person who's going to bear all of the pain for us because it's too much for us to deal with. So what we're doing is we're pulling it back from that person. We're seeing the parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at instead of putting it on someone else. And then we're being with it so that we can be whole. So I come back to that again. Any questions? I'm going to check in every once in a while because it's a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you. Okay. All right, you guys look good. Okay, so the next thing is then figuring out the two tracks, right? So track one is restoring the narrative. So again, when you think about something that happens in your life that is kind of life changing in some way, could be you lose a job, you break up in a relationship, you a hurricane floods your house, you lose your business, something earth shattering, someone you love has an illness, you have an illness, right? There could be any number of those things that occur. And when you're working with restoring, you are crafting a new narrative. So in this case, that terrible thing that happened, whatever the terrible thing is that happened, is a call to adventure. How many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell's hero journey? Okay, a few of you. All right. The basics of the hero journey, even though he's got about 34 steps with a lot of nuances and things, it's this idea that in hero stories from many cultures over time have similar elements to humans rising up against challenges and becoming transformed by it, right? So there's an abbreviated version that I usually use that has 12 steps, and it starts off with ordinary world. Who were you before whatever it is that has occurred, right? Who do you think you are? Like, what are your strengths? What are your skills? What is your day to day? Then, of course, this call to adventure happens. This thing that kind of shifts everything, and it's going to ask you to do something totally different, to take a risk, to change direction, to whatever it might happen to be, or to conquer something that you didn't really even think you'd have to before. So that moment becomes an opportunity, right? And often following that immediately is what's called the refusal of the call. This sense of like, I don't think I'm strong enough. I don't really want this. I don't really know what this is all about. And then a mentor will appear. And a mentor is someone who'll give you some tools that you can use, that you can face that, right? You can make that change, that shift, that step outside of the comfort zone, whatever it might happen to be. And then you end up crossing over the threshold into that new experience, right? And often there are threshold guardians right at that threshold, and there are people who echo back your fear, and they tell you, no, you can't. You can't handle that. You can't, you're not going to succeed at this, whatever it is, but you continue on. And then there's the road of trials. There's things that happen that challenge you. There's wins. There's all kinds of things. But then you go to the ordeal, right? Now the ordeal is actually meeting the shadow. And that's how this ties back into shadow work. Because whatever it is that's occurred that you think you can't handle, that's happened to you, is actually an opportunity for you to meet that piece of yourself that's your shadow that you wouldn't have had an opportunity before. If you lose your job, we talk about sometimes it's redirection, right? So it's redirection for a reason. So it's not just, oh, I was on this path and maybe I should go on this path. It's okay, this path has now stopped for you. So what are you going to do about it? That's an opportunity for you to maybe achieve something totally different and something totally else that you didn't think that you could do before, right? The core story that shows up when that happens of, I'm not capable, I don't think I can do that, or that just feels overwhelming for me, that is a meeting with your shadow. When you look at things like, Star Wars and Luke meeting Darth Vader, right? And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, it's his father, right? So there's core story right there in terms of meeting that piece of himself that was missing, right? And it's the antithesis of him, and he has to meet that and conquer it, right? You look at Harry Potter and Voldemort. You look at, there's so many of these stories. What is that piece of you that's missing that is deemed to be so scary or so overwhelming that you're not able to really face it, right? And once you do meet it and you do conquer it, like the work that we're doing here, then there's a return after that, right? What is the reward that you've gotten from it? How are you transformed from actually meeting that piece of yourself? So the restoring the narrative can be as elaborate as that, writing it out, figuring it out that actually what I think is happening is not what's happening at all. And I've now had an opportunity to meet this part of myself. Or it could just be even more subtle, where it's something happens and you were stymied from something that you intended to do. And now it's like, okay, what is the opportunity in this? What is the call to adventure in this? And the moment that you shift that language, it changes the experience for you, right? Has anyone ever experienced anything like that where they just changed their perspective of something happening as being terrible to now it's an opportunity for me? Yeah, yeah. We've all done it, but consciously doing it, intentionally doing it changes the whole ball game, right? So there's that side of things. There's also other personal mythology work that you can do. There's seeing yourself in a story as a character and how that character interacts with another character, right? I sometimes do mythology work with clients where for example, the story of Demeter and Persephone, for those of you who are familiar with that story from Greek mythology, it's the story of the change of seasons, right? Persephone, who was the daughter, a young, innocent daughter of Zeus and Demeter, and she's abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld, and her mother can't find her anywhere and starts to grieve for her, starts to mourn for her, and comes to find out that she was given to Hades by her father, right, to become his bride. And no one's happy about this, of course, except for Hades. And so Demeter doesn't allow anything to grow, and everything dies. And the farmers call out to Zeus and they say, you know, uh, we need her to make things grow again. And Demeter says, not until my daughter comes back. Right. This whole story, this cyclical nature of her having to go into the underworld. And then the decision is if she's eaten anything under there, she has to return. Otherwise, she can come back to her mother. And so she ate 6 pomegranate seeds right before she was told about that rule. And so she has to periodically go back down and be with her husband down in the underworld and rule over the underworld as queen, and then periodically come back to her mother. Using that story in the dynamics between mothers and daughters, in the storyline of needing to, I had a client once who had a child very, very young. And her family did not approve of the father of the child. And so she left the house and she moved in with him, and he was dangerous as a person. And so she lived that life. She had a second child, and then she finally realized this is not the right thing for me or for my kids. And she left and went back to her parents' house. But she had children with him. She always had to go back into that world again because they had to co-parent, right? So she lived that cycle. So when she saw that story of what was actually happening, she could understand it a little bit more. When she was there, she was the queen of that situation, even though it was not the healthiest of the situations, right? So there's ways in which we can restore the narrative. Another way that I work with people is flipping the script. So that story that you wrote before about a circumstance with someone that was brought up a strong emotional reaction to it. If you were to take a moment and you were to write that story from their point of view in first person, so not what you think they would feel about it, but now you are that person telling that perspective of what's going on. We're not going to ever know everything that's experienced in someone, but you can kind of understand someone's core stories when you do that on a regular basis, right? It gives you a sense to see yourself from the outside, and that maybe your behavior triggered them from something, and they couldn't understand why we were so upset or we were so angry because they were seeing it from a totally different perspective. And I'll tell you a quick story about that before we do this exercise. So again, I had moved across country, and I told you the story earlier. And my sister-in-law at the same time was having, a party for family and friends. And one of the reasons why I had moved cross country was she and my brother had said, we love you. We never get to see you. Come here. You'll meet our friends, it'll be part of our community, you know, it'll be wonderful. And so here I was now living back in the East Coast, and there was this party going on and I wasn't invited. And that for me triggered a story. It immediately triggered, like, I'm not really, no one really cares about me. They're just pretending to care about me. They don't really want me around, or whatever the other stories were at the time. And I came to find out that all that was happening was she had a standard email list that she had been sending out for the last several years that I wasn't living there when there was a get together. And she just, out of rote habit, sent it out again because she had a 1-year-old. She was prepping for a party. She was working part-time and she had a lot on her plate. And that was happening from her. But there was never any thought about me being left out of it. So when I found out about the party, did I very sweetly and thoughtfully and self-aware ask her about the party? No, I did not. Instead, my story just flew out of me and I attacked her verbally for not inviting me. And how could you do this? And after, you know, telling me to move out here. And that triggered a story in her because she was overwhelmed. And how can I not forgive her for being so overwhelmed and for, you know, like assuming that she was trying to hurt me or whatever it is. And it escalated and escalated and escalated. And this was before I had really formulated this work. And I stopped and I, at some point, and I realized that that's all that was happening. Right? That's all that was happening, was my story was hitting her story and was causing a conflict. But once I understood her story, and once she understood my story, there was no conflict, right? We could just fix it for next time. And of course, I was invited. So I invite you now to take a few minutes and look at the story that you wrote and write it now in first person, I, as if you are the other person involved in the situation, if there is another person involved in the situation. I'll just do another minute or two, but this is definitely something you can return to on your own and kind of put, you know, more details in. It's also the harder of the two to do, if you haven't noticed that already. Because we often, it's very hard for us to see it from another side when our own story has been activated, right? And definitely while it's been activated, very hard to see. Now, again, it does not mean that the other person didn't actually do something that was not okay, because that happens, right? I'm not saying that it's excusing bad behavior by somebody else. However, it's really important to first see if it's just your own projection of bad behavior or of something that is not okay, because you can deal with that internally if it was just your own, like, assigning a story to that other person. But if after you do that work, there is something that is not okay, then you address that. But you're addressing it from knowing who you are and knowing your part of the story first. Right? Any questions on any of that? Does anyone want to share? You do not have to. You can share either an insight that you had or what the experience was like to tell the story from, to attempt to tell the story from the other person's point of view.
I can share. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, this was helpful for me. I think it helped me to empathize with this other person. I usually feel like I'm an empathetic person in general, so I've never really felt like I needed to go that step further. But in actually putting that into practice, I realized, oh, I can actually take that empathy even further, and that helps me personally to feel less like activated by the situation, I think.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And I actually while I was still teaching and working on this and developing Unstorying, I created a conflict resolution process for kids called Footsteps. And we used to use it as adults too in the faculty in the school, but it basically has the same premise where instead of it being like, I hear what you're saying blah, 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 which still separates us from the other person. But by telling your story, the facts of it, then they tell the facts of it, then you tell how it made you feel, and they tell how it made you feel. With little kids, they've cut out their feet in poster board and they put them on the ground, they're standing in it, and then they go and they stand in the other person's footsteps, right? And as adults or middle schoolers did not want to do that. It was not considered cool, but you still switch places. And there's the act of telling the story as now first person from that other person's point of view. Half the time we didn't get to the end of the conflict resolution steps, which was like, what will you do differently next time? And and all of these sort of things. Instead, there'd be this moment of awareness in these kids where they'd go, oh, now I know what that like now I know how you felt. Like I feel it myself. They're actually you now in that moment. And that comes from partially this work and also non-duality, this sense that you really are connected to that other person and you are experiencing something for you and they the same. And so that shift in perspective. So we can do this in our everyday life when we're doing this work, right? And then so quickly now the other side, the non-dual, the dissipating, right? And you can go back and forth between the stories. Sometimes we need to shift our story and have a healthier story because the mind is engaged in the story. And sometimes we really can see that the story is irrelevant, right? That is our story. It will always be one of our stories. Our core stories stay with us forever. So this is not about healing the inner child or healing the story. You're healing your relationship with the story is basically what it is. It will always be what made up part of your persona, part of your personality, right? But our awareness of it and our relationship to it changes. So with the dissipating, you look at that situation that occurred, you take back the projection, you see the I feel story underneath it. And you say to yourself, wow, I am so grateful that that opportunity came up again for me to see that that story still generates, oomph in me, right? That it still operates in me, that it still could make me make a decision or jump into a pattern again that's not healthy for me because I'm experiencing that yet again. And it does lead to gratitude eventually when you do it. It's painful and it's challenging, but at some point you do feel this this sense of if your focus or you resonate with the idea of consciousness or spirit or God or whatever it is that kind of you feel connected to, that there is this movement of things towards you understanding yourself better, to you seeing yourself and you eventually accepting all of who you are, that is what is pushing this to happen, right? So these opportunities keep coming up for you to see, oh, that story 42B, that story 37A, or whatever, however many stories you have, but again, probably only 4 or 5. But you can start to recognize your stories as they crop up each time. And there's a relief that comes from that when you realize you don't always have to fight every story, because a lot of the stories are coming from inside you in that dynamic. So what I want to do now that we are here at a few minutes after 8, is I want to do a guided visualization, if you're all okay with that. And this guided visualization is going to start off with square breathing. And then I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. And in that journey, they're going to be, we're going to go into the psyche, a little bit into the shadow. We're going to have some experiences. I'm going to make some suggestions, but they're going to be very generalized suggestions, right? Like you're walking into a room, whatever it is, whatever you see when I say that is yours. So notice the descriptions that you see. Notice what something looks like. If I say tree, what does that tree look like to you? If I say door, what does the door look like to you? Right? Take note of all of those things. There'll be times in there that there'll be messages that will come. If no message comes for you, do not judge it. Just be like, oh, okay. You're just observing, right? The experience. As soon as we're done, I'm going to ask you, before I say anything, you say anything, write it all down, all the details that you can remember, because this is all going to be information for you about you. Okay. Any questions before we begin? And yes, you can all turn your videos off for this. That's fine. But if you have any question, I'm here. No? Okay. All right, here we go. So as long as you're sitting somewhere quiet and comfortable. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do square breathing. And so for that, it's to breathe in. I do a count to 5, but do whatever feels comfortable for you. So breathe in for a count to 5, hold it in for a count to 5, breathe out for a count to 5, and hold it out for a count to 5. Okay, so here we go. And breathe in. Hold it in. Breathe out. Hold it out. Breathe in for 5. Hold it in for 5. Breathe out for a count to 5. Hold it out for a count to 5. We're going to do this one more time. In. Hold it in. Out. Hold it out. And I want you to see yourself in a place that you find peaceful, comforting. Could be an outdoor setting. Just imagine yourself somewhere that gives you great comfort. And in your mind's eye, you're going to look around yourself. You're going to look up at the sky or the ceiling, depending on if you're inside or outside. What does it look like? What colors do you see? You're going to look out at the distance. What's around you? What objects? What do you notice? What sounds do you hear? And then you're going to draw your awareness to what's underneath you. Are you standing? Are you sitting? Where your body connects with what is underneath you, the ground. What does that feel like? Does it have a texture? Are there any smells? And as you breathe in this place that is so comfortable and peaceful and safe, you notice off to your right that there's a path leading through the trees. And you find yourself on this path, walking through the trees, looking up to the treetops, noticing branches or anything that might be there. Maybe touching the bark as you pass by. And as you continue along the path, the trees get a bit denser. And you find yourself at a doorway in the middle of the woods. This doorway could have a door or it might not have a door. Notice what color it is. What is it made of? What does it look like? Does it have a doorknob or not, if it has a door? You're going to walk through that doorway and find yourself on a staircase leading down. And as you walk down the staircase, you feel curious, you feel safe. And you end up in a library when you get to the bottom of the stairs. This is your library. Look around and see what it looks like. What's in there? How is it decorated? You walk over to one of the bookshelves and you see a book that has your name on the spine. You pull that book off the bookshelf and you flip through its pages. It contains memories of things that have happened to you in your life, experiences you've had. And it also contains pages with things and experiences that have yet to come. They might be pictures. They might be words. It might just be symbols. But as your fingers flip through the pages, it stops on one page. And on that page is a piece of information that you need to have right now. Something that you need to be aware of, or that can help you with something that you're facing right now. Spend some time looking at that message. If the page is blank, don't worry about that. And then you're going to close the book and put that back on the bookshelf. That book is yours and it will always be there for you anytime that you are in this library. And then turn behind you and you notice that there's 2 chairs. You go and sit in one chair. And in a moment, you notice that there's another doorway down leading off of the library into another room. That door opens and someone walks through, someone who you need to speak to, has some information for you, has some advice for you, maybe some comfort. They join you in the chairs and you can ask them anything. Spend a moment asking them whatever questions you need to know. And after you've asked them your questions, they walk you over to that door that they came through. And they open that door for you. And when you walk in, the first thing you notice is that the room has 3 sections. The first section is in bright light. This is the room of your psyche. The section in bright light has all the things that you know about yourself, experiences you've had, memories that you do still remember in your conscious mind, characteristics about yourself, experiences. This is who you show the world who you are and who you know yourself to be. And then you look over to the second section of the room. And that one's a bit hazier. It's almost like there's a fog surrounding it, but you can just make out the images that you see. And these may be people, characters, maybe symbols, words. These are the things that are just taking a step out of your shadow, that you have started to learn about yourself, that you're not fully understanding what they may mean for you, but you've just become aware that they exist, that maybe there's something you need to embrace or face. And then you look over to the third section of the room, and that place is in pitch black. It's dark. So in your pocket, you find either a flashlight or a candle or a headlamp, something to illuminate the space. And you make your way over to the dark section of the room. You're not going to interact with anything in that dark section today. You're just there to observe and to see what's there. Nothing that's there can hurt you. You just want to shine a little bit of light so that you can see what might be there. And again, this could be a person, a symbol, an experience, a word, a concept. And if you don't see anything in one of these sections or all of these sections, that's okay too. So as you take note and you acknowledge what you see, turn back and walk back through the hazy area and back through the well-lit section and back to the doorway into the library, and thank the visitor who came to answer your questions and give you advice. And ascend the steps back up to the first doorway that you walked through. You find yourself back out in the forest path. And as you wander down that path back to the original place where you began, place of peace and comfort and safety, take a deep breath in that place. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and start writing down everything you can remember from your experience. And then I ask that when you're done, you turn your video back on so that I know that you're ready for the next thing. And anything that you didn't have a chance to write down, you can always kind of go back and add more stuff to it. But I find that if we don't journal it right away, that often there are details that we forget, right? Um, is there anyone who wants to share a piece of what they saw or experienced? You can choose how little or how much that you share. Maybe something that you want to have some insight into, or what your door looks like, or what the library looked like, or just what the experience felt like for you, even if there isn't content that's shared.
Can share about my door.
Okay.
So it was on a curved wall, and the door was curved too to kind of match it, and there was no doorknob, and I didn't know how to open it, and then somebody pushed it open for me.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So all of the things that show up in our guided visualization are ourself, right? They're aspects of ourself. So when everyone is not only for Michelle, but for everyone, when you think about your door, right? And you think about your interaction with the door, and or what the door looks like it might represent to you, think about what that might tell you about your core stories, right? So that's what we use all the symbols for, right? So the walk through the place where we feel comfortable in the beginning, that's sometimes surprising to ourselves and sometimes not, but sometimes it's a familiar place. But that's also just to get you kind of into to get your heart regulated and get you kind of in that space. The pathway is a typical pathway that's taking you on a journey, going through a doorway. The doorway is that threshold between the conscious you, the outside you, and the inner you, because we're entering your psyche when we go into that space. And then when we go down, we descend down into you, right? And so then the library room, however you saw the library, some people see it big and expansive, some people see it as like cozy, sometimes it's really old, sometimes it's very modern, maybe there's windows, I've had people tell me that they've seen stained glass, I've had people tell me that it was like really simple, but this is kind of your store of memories too, in general. It's the story of your life, and it's the place that holds that story. So when you think about, what does it look like? What was the feeling you got when you were in there? What did you notice? Were there any frustrations that you had? Right? I've had people flip through the book, and I'm talking about seeing old memories and seeing things to come, and they're like, it was empty. It was blank. And so then my response to them is, well, what did that feel like? To really look forward to having some sort of insight or information, and there's nothing there, right? Because that is something that you can now know about yourself, right? That always, like, I'm always disappointed because I never get what I need, right? That's a story. So each step along the way is an opportunity for you to see another piece of your story. Also, the information that might show up in that book, something that only you need to know, the person or being that came and sat with you, and you can ask them questions or they can tell you something about yourself, that's always going to be an aspect of you. Sometimes it's our own higher self that visits. Sometimes it's a loved one that's passed on. Sometimes it's a guide. Sometimes it's someone we have never seen before. We have no idea who they are. But who they represent to you, is that the voice of wisdom, right? Was that someone who always gave you good advice? And so now that part of you that is that comforting, wise advice person, or is it, who is it that you got that information from? And then when you went into the door of the psyche itself, and you saw the conscious mind, the things that you know about yourself already, and the things that you've yet to kind of really come to terms with, and the part in the dark of the shadow, right? That we have forgotten about, moments in time, memories, experiences, characteristics about ourselves. Now, I should say also, we didn't talk about the golden shadow. And the golden shadow is the rather than it being like this dark and scary, you know, aspects of ourself, with most people associate with the shadow, but it's not necessarily. It's just the parts that are hidden from us. They're hidden from view, right? And inaccessible, we think. The golden shadow are those parts of us that are hidden from view, that might have been something that was a skill or a gift or an aspect of our personality that we were told was not okay to have. Right? If you loved to dance as a kid and you danced around your house and you had parents who said to you, stop doing that. Stop doing that. It's too frivolous. You know, go study. Or you wanted to be a painter and you were told, no, you need to do something more practical, right? If you didn't continue to pursue that in some part of your life, it gets shoved into the shadow, and that is part of your golden shadow. Those are part of the wonderful, extraordinary aspects of yourself that you have not embraced fully and brought into the conscious part of you. So that's a really important thing. That's another whole webinar I usually do on creativity and the golden shadow, because that's where creativity often lies, right? That we're now afraid of showing that to the world because we have been given a story that that's not okay. But whatever you saw in that dark area, again, doesn't have to be scary, just unknown to you as of yet, right? And then we return with that new information. And this guided visualization, you can watch this replay over and you can go again and see other things in the book. You can always go visit again and walk into the room of the psyche, and learn new things, you know, about yourself. So I know we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to say, you know, the only other part of the puzzle of the elements of unstorying is this surrender to the flow of life, because this process, this shadow work process of understanding yourself and becoming whole, when we start to see our life that's unfolding, when things are happening that we find challenging or we have those moments, if we instead see them as opportunities, then what happens is we do find ourselves in the flow of life, and things just kind of lead us to places that we couldn't possibly imagine, because we are becoming more whole and we are embracing more possibilities than we did before. Instead of keeping ourselves in a narrow box of who we think we are and how we think we should respond to things, we're now expanding the possibilities of our life. And so I think that that's, you know, really kind of important to keep in mind. I will say that I know Michelle is going to send out a follow-up email that's going to have my website, how you can work with me, and I'm going to offer also a 10% discount on my session cycle for anyone who's an AB member, especially if you've come to the webinar, because you have a lot of this kind of the intro materials. And what happens is when I work with people, it's a 3-session cycle. So you sign up for the 3 sessions, and we immediately in the first session unearth some of these core stories and show you how they appear in your world, how they are showing up even in ways that you don't even realize that they are interfering or creating dynamics. And then we go through those 3 sessions and it comes full cycle. So by the end, you're turning that story on its head, so that in a real way, a visceral way, so that you can see that that is one of your stories, but it does not have to run the show anymore, in a real practical way. So that is the way in which I work with people, or with organizations who are dealing with the stories that are an interconnected web, as we were kind of talking about before, and how we all bring our stories to a group dynamic and helping to unravel that. So thank you, Michelle. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that, but.
No, I'll just send an email out with the information, and I think that the presentation too that I have, or that the thing you showed in the beginning, that's part of it too. So I'll send that out via email, and also in the Facebook group, I'll post the video of this, and I'll send it out in the email as well. So
Great.
Thank you, Nicole. This was really neat. Love it.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Okay, have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.